Hello, my dear friends. I'm very glad to have the first time this year Mark Sleboda from Moscow here on the show. Mark Sleboda is an international analytics and security analyst. And I'm glad we meet together on this 24th of January 2026. How are you doing?
Mark, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the show. And I'm alive. How the hell are you?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm also alive. We have now winter in Germany, but not the winter you have in Moscow. This is kindergarten. What you have in Moscow is real winter. What we have is, let's say, it's a little bit cold, but this is normal in this time in the year, should be. Yeah, the first thing...
Well, then the weather is a perfect allegory for the political situation, isn't
it? Yes, real winter, real politic, and the clone show here in Europe. The first thing, where can people find you with your excellent work?
Great. So, the place you can find me is right up here. The Real Politique on Boosty. I'm a Russian citizen living in Russia. Therefore, of course, I am under your government's lovely sanctions, and the normal means of online, self-generation, YouTube, Substack, Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee. None of that works for me. But Boosty is sanction-proof. It's essentially a Patreon clone. But it's sanctions-proof. It's good for everybody. It's worked well for me, and most of my subscribers are from the West, so no problem there. And I put all of my work up on the Boosty. Anyone can follow. That's no problem. But I also have membership levels, and those who join, there is a lot of exclusive content, as I'm sure Mark can tell you, yes. And a private Discord channel and other things.
Yes, I will link the Boosty in the description box, and you can find it. And I will hope many people from Germany will follow you on Boosty. Okay, so let's start. We have had the Davos meeting this week. We have there a big clown show. And we have the two American guys, Mr. Kuschner and Mr. Witkoff, running again to Moscow. And we have also heard of a meeting in the UAE. Perhaps we can start with this. What is going on the diplomatic scene in Moscow and in the UAE?
Okay, so first, coming to Moscow was Witkoff. Again, Trump's, personal envoy, because he doesn't trust anyone in the State Department, and his son-in-law, Jared Kuschner. Also, there was a third official, I think his name is Grusbaum. He's from Acquisitions, but I take it his actual role there, as I understand, he is prominent in arranging Trump's so-called Board of Peace or Peace Council, or I don't know, it's a giant mafia protection racket as far as I'm concerned. But that I believe is probably why he was coming as well. Now, the way these meetings are suggested is a rejuvenation of the diplomatic process, and they led directly into the trilateral meetings that occurred on Friday and Saturday. The first trilateral meetings in Abu Dhabi, in the UAE, with Russia, Ukraine, and the US all present at those discussions. So this obviously was essentially a prelude to that. Now, the real reason for this sudden, the Kiev regime and its U.S. patron are desperate for a ceasefire, particularly on the long-range strikes, the Russian strikes on the Kiev regime's energy infrastructure, because the Kiev regime is really it's on the ropes as far as energy goes. They really, there's only 2 functioning power plants in the entire country at this moment. Those are both nuclear power plants. Now Russia, those are in West Ukraine, now that are still in the Kiev regime's hands. Now, Russia is not going to bomb nuclear power plants, of course, but they don't have to. There are 750 kilovolt substations that take the electricity from those nuclear power plants and then put it into the Ukrainian national electricity grid. And all Russia has to do is take out those substations. And I believe, I have heard some initial reports, do not consider this confirmed, that last night's strikes took out at least one of those stations. So obviously, Russia has not agreed to any energy infrastructure ceasefire. I mean, they've let it be known before. And you may remember that it was just a year ago that, brokered by Trump, there was a ceasefire on energy infrastructure that Russia abided for with a month, that the Kiev regime never agreed to, and continued its attacks on, and we now know that these attacks were directed by the CIA. These were attacks on Russian oil refineries, and the New York Times has, for the CIA, bragged across their pages how the CIA has been responsible for all of the attacks on the refineries. They're directing it, even to the point of having the Kiev regime target specific couplers that they believed would lead to longer downtimes, longer repair times to put the refineries up. And they have also more recently been involved directing the Kiev regime's attacks on civilian oil tankers. Well, not just oil tankers, actually. Civilian maritime traffic in the Black Sea and in the Med and in the Atlantic that simply trades with Russia. Right? So a clear case of, I don't know if you want to call it piracy, which it definitely falls under those categories, under the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. And although these ships, some of them were Russian flagged, some of them were not. I mean, it is obviously a act of war on Russia. That's okay. There's an ongoing conflict. But it is, they've also attacked non-Russian tankers that were simply trading with Russia. And that is similarly, if those countries really, wish to be at war with Ukraine, that would certainly give them Joseph Bill. The CIA has been directing all of this, right? And the New York Times tell us that Trump gave them the green light, and he was very happy to be able to escalate against Russia to a level that the Blinken-Sullivan administration never did. But because it's being conducted by the CIA, it's quote unquote beneath the covers. So he gets to play that he's some third party neutral arbiter and shuffling the war off on the Europeans, and it's not my war. The standard mantra. Get your drinking cards out. If I had been president, this war never would have happened. Blah blah blah. But the reality is quite different. The Kiev regime in the U.S. thus have been waging this energy war, and Russia went to a ceasefire, and they continued it, and Russia's a month later is like, okay, that's it, we're done. Now it's your turn. and or now it's our turn, I guess, to dish it back, and that is what has happened, particularly over the last few months. And Russia has been able to attack the Kiev regime's energy infrastructure, and they've also been targeting the Kiev regime's transport infrastructure, their train system simultaneously, and of course the remnants of the military-industrial complex in a way that they never have been able to before, because of their military industrial production levels. One of Garan drones, and the Garan drones have all kinds of variant evolutions now. Garan 2, Garan 3 Black, Garan 5, they all have different capabilities, including jet engines and capable of firing air-to-air missiles, some of them evasion maneuvers, AI algorithms, all sorts of very specific evolutionary variants, giving them a whole panoply of different capabilities there. And according to the Kiev regime, according to Zelensky, Russia is now producing 1,000 Garan drones a day.
And they're not using it a day, yeah.
They're not using, right? They're obviously stockpiling. And this was actually pointed out in general about Russian armaments, right? I'm sure, Russia's running out of missiles, Russia is running out of rations, Russia's running out of, everything. That's the headlines. But the German defense minister, Boris Pistorius, last year commented that Russia's military-industrial production is so high that they're producing far more military equipment and armaments and munitions across the board than they are using in the special military operation. Therefore, they are stockpiling it. And why are they stockpiling it? In case the war turns into a direct conflict with NATO, right? That's why. That's also why the Financial Times has reported that Russia has 2 entire reserve armies, a total of some 280,000 troops, professional contract soldiers, right, that signed up for the special military operation, that are being held in reserve, that have not even been put into the theater. Why? Deterrence, right? To let it be known to NATO, to the Europeans and the US, that if you want to step into this, we've got this waiting for you. Right? That's what it's there for. Now, eventually it may be deployed if it becomes clear that NATO is not going to become involved. But right now, I believe ultimately it's there as a deterrent. And Russia is more or less happy with the pace of the current war of attrition. The one on the contact line, right on the ground, but of course also much more this long-range strike war of attrition that has blacked Ukraine out, right? Their major cities, Kryvyi Rog, Zaporozhye in the south, Dnipropetrovsk, Odessa, they've been without power for as much as a week now. And in Kiev, they have rotating. They're lucky if they can get 3 hours of electricity, heat a day. And that's at minus 20 Celsius temperatures in the winter. And if there's no electricity, that means there's no heating. It means there's no water. And it also means there's no plumbing, right? And even they're talking about shutting the metro down because they can't afford the electricity cost of keeping it up. The mayor of Kiev, the former boxer and Maidan figurehead Vitaly Klitschko, has multiple times now urged the citizens, the residents of Kiev, to evacuate the city if they can, because they simply can't maintain the city. Now, all of this sounds really terrible from a strictly humanitarian point of view, because while it is undeniable that there are military purposes for this, right? Electricity also powers the military-industrial complex. It also powers the train, the military logistics and everything. But of course, it has an outsized effect on civilians. And that might be a concern if that wasn't NATO's playbook for every war that they've been involved in, right? We can talk the US and NATO in general, right? You know, whether we're talking the organization or the member states on their own, in Afghanistan and Iraq, in Libya, in Syria even, but particularly noteworthy, of course, is the European country that they attacked and then dismembered, Serbia. In fact, in 1999, when the U.S. was bombing the Serbian energy infrastructure heading into the winter, there was a press conference where the NATO spokesperson at the time, Jamie Shea, was asked questions by the press about this and about the impact on civilians. And that transcript, in it, and you can find this out there. He said that it is attacking electrical energy infrastructure is a completely legitimate myth. As for the civilian consequences, Jamie Shea said, the NATO spokesperson said that that this is Milosevic's problem. And if Milosevic wants his people to have heat and electricity in the winter, then all he has to do is surrender to NATO's 5 conditions. That's all he has to do, right? He was asked directly about this, and he dismissed the humanitarian concerns like that. So NATO has clearly set the precedent, and not even just in far-flung countries, but in a European country. That transcript, by the way, just over a week ago, was removed from NATO's online archives. It's been there for, I don't know, 26 years now?
Yeah, 26 years.
Yeah, 26 years. And just last week, it disappeared offline, 404, cannot be found now. But of course, the internet does not forget. And it must be said that Russia does not forget, and they do not forgive. So as much as this is a real tragedy for the people of Ukraine, this is the state of geopolitical war between Russia and NATO. Russia cannot shirk at what NATO has already done, of course, to Europeans in the course of winning a conflict.
And perhaps one thing, the raid on Serbia was the first fighting missions after the Second World War. The German army were participating. Yes. I was in this time. I was soldier by myself for a few months, and this was the time when
I'm a vet. I'm a U.S. vet as well. So,
and they put my sergeant after in this time he was grabbed out of the office and put to the forces invading Kosovo in '99, and he was one of the few German soldiers who had been to a mission out of the borders in that time. I think he was in Africa with an UN mission 1993, and he was grabbed out of the office and had to go to Kosovo. This is what I remember, and this was one of the things after I said, okay, guys, I think I will leave the army, or I will not stay in the army because I don't want to be cannon fodder for American interests at this time.
And that, of course, was fighting for, the creation, fighting for the previously listed as a terrorist organization in the United States and in the UN and in the United States, the Kosovo Liberation Army, which was, of course, allied with Al Qaeda at the time.
And they told us at this time there must be some military action from Germany because we have to go. That nothing will happen like it happened between 1942 and 44 in Eastern Europe, and this was a very big thing in Germany and a big role, and it were the SPD and the Green Party, the Peace Party in Germany, who sent first time German soldiers again in a war scenario. This is what the history tells us about peace parties. But let's go back to the Ukraine. What is the military situation?
Yeah, so that's why. Yeah. So I mean, anyway, that's the reason why the U.S. and the Kiev regime are so desperate for an energy strike ceasefire. You know, they're offering to give up their strikes on Russian oil refineries and so far. They also routinely take some shots at the city of Belgorod. With U.S. HIMARS, which can reach Belgorod from the urban environs of Kharkov. That's the one place they can hit. And they routinely try to hit the electrical infrastructure in Belgorod. And sometimes they even succeed. There are some shots they get through Russian air defense. But of course, Russia can quickly repair them. I mean, within hours or a day at most. So it is, of course, a completely different scale. And Russia, the oil refinery strikes, as much as they've been blown up in the Western media, they are a pinprick, right? And numerous outlets, including Bloomberg, have reported that, you know, despite all of this, Russia's refining capacity has barely been touched. They're talking about a 2% drop year on year, and they've actually had increase in unrefined sales because, you know, where there has been a slight temporary downtick from refining, then it simply sold more crude. Right, so to the market instead of refined. So it hasn't affected the Russian economy noticeably in any way. So Russia is not going to agree to this. They're not going to give up their advantage when they really, in a very significant way that a lot of people don't understand, right? With these long-range strikes, have the Kiev regime on the ropes. Right? They're not going to give that up. And I think we've already seen that. The talks in Abu Dhabi are, they're being led on the Russian side by Admiral Yegor Kostyukov, whom is the head of the Russian military intelligence, the GRU, right? And on the Kiev regime side, they have Umerov, who was the former defense minister. He's still the head of the National Security Council. But Budanov, Kyrylo, I like the dark Budanov, the Banderite. He was formerly longtime head of the Kiev regime's military intelligence, brought up and groomed to that position by the U.S. When, as the New York Times, you know, quite openly admitted, after the 2014 putsch, the U.S. came into Ukraine. They took over the Kiev regime's intelligence agencies, the SBU and the GUR, and they rebuilt them from the ground up in their own image. And Kyrylo Budanov at the top of the GUR. Now Budanov has replaced Andrei Yermak as Zelensky's chief of staff. In the Kiev regime's political terms, making him potentially the second most politically powerful man, or potentially the most powerful political man, depending on how you read the Zelensky-Yermak relationship, but making him very political powerful. That's they're discussing. They're discussing this. And what that tells me is this is not about any type of general settlement of the conflict. They're not talking about that. They're talking specifically, almost certainly, about probably not just the war of long-range strikes, but also you could say the dirty war, right? That the Kiev regime has been waging. David Ignatius talked about it very openly in the Washington Post, how as the Kiev regime is continues to do worse on the battlefield, they will turn to assassinations and terrorism and bombings and, you know, asymmetric strikes like Operation Spiderweb with the drones and so forth. And one of those attacks just in the last month was a mass drone attack on the Russian state presidential residence in the Novgorod region at Valdai, which the Russians read as an attempted assassination of President Putin. And this occurred while in between conversations with President Trump. He had a conversation with President Trump, and then President Trump said, okay, just wait there. I'm going to talk to Zelensky, and then I'll call you back in a few hours. And in that time period, that's when the drone attack occurred. And I guess Trump was shocked and outraged. Oh my God, you're still alive! How great, and they pretended it was a strike on something else, of course, and so forth. But the word that the rumor in Russian telegram circles and so forth is that this attack has infuriated Putin in a way that nothing ever has before, because members of his family were also at Valdai. In particular, one of his daughters was there, and he sees this as an attack on his family, on his child as well. So he is incensed, and really this has pushed the war to another level. Russia may still be going through these diplomatic measures, but let's just say there's no sincerity or heart in them anymore. It's going through it for diplomatic reasons. I believe that this meeting was an attempt by the U.S., and I would not be surprised at all that U.S. intelligence representatives were there as well. That we may not hear that, or we may find out later. But this is perhaps an attempt by the U.S. to signal de-escalation, right? In response, particularly with that, but of course also with a range of other attacks that have occurred. That's not definite, but I think considering the makeup, particularly of the Russian delegation that is sent there, and some of the Ukrainians who are there, tells me that this is not a general settlement that they're discussing, that they are discussing specific, shall we say, methodology of how the conflict is being called out on the intelligence and asymmetric and long-range strike side. And anyway, the word out of those talks is that they were positive, constructive, and that there were some results. I mean, those are the words we've heard. We've also heard the talks between the Russians and Americans in Moscow. Witkoff described those discussions as constructive and extremely frank. And if you know anything about Diplo speak, extremely frank means there was no agreement whatsoever, and they were probably just shy of what would be considered a row, of a screaming match. So anyway, I don't expect anything, certainly not regards to the end of the conflict, to come out of these talks, but there may be some, shall we say, behind closed doors agreement about the way the war of shadows, or the dirty war, is being conducted. That was discussed there. Whether there was any, agreement on that or not, but I believe that is what Abu Dhabi was want. But if the U.S. and the Kiev regime wanted an energy strike ceasefire coming out of those talks, they did not get it. They are not going to get it. There will be no ceasefire. Or Putin has said that ad nauseum for years now, and the Europeans and the Americans, of course, that's what they want, right? They don't want to surrender the Kiev regime. They can't accept Russian conditions, so they just want time to rebuild, rearm, give the Kiev regime more time to mass conscript, more cannon fodder, and that's all they have. So. That is the state of diplomacy.
Okay, so I will read out of this. This is more a charade and a kabuki theater. and nothing real behind it, or what we also see in the West. And now Russia and US are talking, and peace is just around the corner, what we hear the last 3 years, and all of this, things, I don't want to say the word with BS.
With regards to a settlement of the conflict, it is important to note that negotiations with Russia have not even begun. They have not.
Yeah.
All of this 28-point plan, 20-point plan, this point plan, that point plan has all been the U.S. and the Kiev regime and the Europeans in a giant circle jerk arguing amongst themselves. And nothing has actually been presented to the Russians as even a basis for negotiations yet, because Trump still, despite all the leverage that he supposedly has, and he does have, he should have over the Kiev regime, he can't get them to agree to some of Russia's most basic points, territorial concessions, the Donbass, which Russia has made clear. All right, so I mean, if we get everything we want somehow out of diplomacy, that's fine. But if not, we're fine with that too, because we're achieving everything we want on the ground. Donbass will be completely in Russian hands by the end of the year. Kherson and Zaporozhye within a year after that, and we'll already be deep in other territory, looking at Odessa and Kharkov and Dnipropetrovsk, by that time as well. So Russia is perfectly happy, and Putin has said that. We are actually happier achieving the results on the ground with the special military operation, because the West can't see reason. They can't accept the military realities on the ground, and we're not going to accept anything less than what we've earned with our blood and suffering, economic and otherwise, through these last 4 years of conflict, or last really since 2014. So last going on 12 years now in reality, and we're not going to settle for anything less because we're winning, and we won't.
I also think this will be the outcome, but where you think the US or the CIA or the deep state wants to create the next mess for Russia? Will this be Iran, the Gulf? Will it be, let's say, in the Caucasus, where we can from now on have to look when the next thing will come? Or will it be Moldova with putting them or getting them perhaps to Romania and getting these two countries locked together, and then having NATO again back on nearer on the Russian enclave in Moldova, for example?
Yeah, that's a problem. There's so many possible vectors of horizontal escalation on the U.S. side. And we've already seen a color revolution with obvious U.S. backing in Nepal, right? We've seen the overthrow of the Syrian government, largely through co-option and corruption of the military and political elite in Syria. And the West has, with open arms, embraced the new Al-Qaeda, the literal previously Islamic State of Iraq and Al-Qaeda, because Jilani was both, now ruling over Syria. And in the last week, the U.S. has even thrown their own previous proxy, the Kurds, very bloodily under the bus in Syria. And Al-Qaeda has already run over most of eastern Syria. And the U.S. is just like, yeah, we're probably going to withdraw from Syria, and Al-Qaeda's got this. So they're happy with that. Now, Al-Qaeda has the oil fields that had been denied for years, right, to the Syrian government. So now they'll have an economic chance, of course, and the removal of sanctions and everything else, and Jelani, a wanted terrorist with a multi-million, it's a 10 million or 50 million wanted prize in the United States that was just removed now, greeted in the White House, with Trump talking about what a handsome, strong man he is. Just other obscenities. So on top of that, we've seen the kidnapping, the attack on Venezuela, the kidnapping of the Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, dragged back as a kidnapped victim for a kangaroo court in the United States. And this was almost certainly done, once again, not by there was obviously a U.S. special military a special forces operation, but this was clearly done through CIA co-option, bribery, blackmail, threats, whatever it took, with the Venezuelan political and military leadership, in particular the new acting president, Delcy Rodriguez, and her brother Jorge Rodriguez were instrumental in this, and this has been openly discussed in Western papers, in The Guardian and elsewhere, and almost certainly the Venezuelan defense minister, Lopez, as well, because Maduro, where he was taken from was literally a compound in the middle of the largest and most well-fortified military base in Venezuela, and yet not one shot was fired. No air defense was activated. Even if you want to say the U.S. electronic warfare shut everything down, they had 5,000 heat-seeking Igla man-pads provided by Russia. And none of those were fired at low-flying helicopters streaking over the city, over the military base to pick up Maduro. The only ones who apparently fought and died for him was his Cuban security detail. And the fact that he felt he needed a Cuban security detail tells you how much he trusted his own military and security services people. And both Dmitry Medvedev and Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, the intelligence minister of Belarus, have all spoken about how this was an act of betrayal by the Venezuelan leadership. So this was arranged by the CIA. Venezuela, the new government there, the regime is in place, but the nature of the regime has been completely changed, through this co-option, and now they're effectively a U.S. colony, and the U.S. has complete access to their energy resources. So that's happened, and now they're talking. The Wall Street Journal is talking about how the U.S. now is going to attempt an oil blockade, leading to a regime change in Cuba. And obviously, they're moving a very large amount of military assets, including the Abraham Lincoln Carrier Group, refueling Strato, refueling air vehicles and all kinds of air power to the Middle East for another attack on Iran, with the latest Mossad CIA insurgent attack under the guise of protests not having succeeded. So horizontal spread all over the place. Again, this is really one big global conflict being fought in multiple theaters. And I believe that at some point in the future, we'll recognize that we are already well into World War III. It's just happening at different places. And I believe the Financial Times, but there was a Western paper that in the last few days talked about how beneficial not just regime change in Iran would be, but also splitting up the country along religious ethnic lines, because that always works out so well, would be so wonderful. Not just because it would take Iran off the table of the Middle East geopolitically, but specifically they would point out it would hurt Russia and China geopolitically. They specifically talked about that repeatedly. So I almost certainly that is the thinking of, whether you want to call it the blob, the deep state, the permanent bureaucracy, right? The U.S. foreign policy, military, and security services elite. They're operating from this chessboard, geopolitical chessboard frame of mind. Oh, you want to take our knight in Ukraine away from us? Well, then we'll take Nepal and Syria and Iran, and wherever else they want to take away from you. And it's a cost. Russia is laser focused on Ukraine, right? They're like, you want to say a pit bull, right? Or something else that has their adversary by the throat and will not let go, no matter what is happening over here, over there, all around. And there are geopolitical costs. There are sincere geopolitical costs. But as far as Russia is concerned, Ukraine is an existential security and even civilizational threat that they have to win, and they have to win in a big way now. I don't think we're just talking, the Donbass. I think we're talking that NATO needs to be seen as being defeated definitively in Ukraine for really a body blow to U.S.-led Western global hegemony. That's the view from Moscow.
Okay, and what do you think? Because we have now the row about Greenland. Trump says he wants to have Greenland. He wants to have the part of Denmark, and it's now he wants to build, I don't know, golf courses, military bases, more. I know they can do, but he wants to own it. On the other side, This is also a blow, from my view, to the NATO, to the European Union, which will be affected over this, because we in Europe are only vessels. And I think many of the guys in the high ranks now getting the grip that they are also on the chopping block. Because what do you think? If the US will lose the Ukraine and Russia will move to the border, let's say to Poland or near Western Ukraine or in this direction, and the US will go home. I think so, because I can't imagine US forces will step in a hot war on the ground in Europe over Poland or something like this. And now the Western elites in Europe get a grip that daddy will stay at home and not will come to rescue, but he will grab what he can out of Europe, because this is also low-hanging free fruit, perhaps.
So Bart de Wever, the Belgian prime minister, at Davos this week spoke exactly in those terms, and he said that there is a difference between being literally a happy vassal and an unhappy slave, right? That's he used literally those words. So echoing exactly what you said there. So here's the thing, right? We can talk all sorts of things about the geostrategic value of Greenland, right? Which has largely not been used throughout most of the Cold War, right? Certainly never in an active way. It is still a frozen glacier-covered wasteland, whatever, mountainous, with very difficult terrain. Yes, there are rare earths there, but the fact that they have not been exploited so far, right, those rare earths, they're not actually that rare, right? It's actually refining them that is the difficult part, and getting them from under ice-covered glacier mountains in Greenland, right? There's a reason it hasn't been done, is because it's difficult to extract them and it's not profitable, right? The same thing, yeah, there's the potential for oil and gas fields offshore with climate change and so forth, but that's all theoretical. And with the talk of, increased U.S. bases, right? Erecting Trump's fantasy Golden Dome air and missile defense system, or we can talk, underwater submarine patrol paths, the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. We can talk about all of that. It's not actually the matter, because under the 1951 Copenhagen Treaty, the U.S. has the right militarily to do whatever they want in Greenland. In fact, during the Cold War, they had 10,000 U.S. troops on Greenland at one point. They were trying to build an under-ice network of tunnels to hide mobile nuclear weapons under. The whole thing was some kind of James Bond villain, fantasy that didn't play out, right? But anyway, they can do militarily whatever they want in Greenland. If they wanted to invest in Greenland resources, right, I am quite sure that could be arranged by Denmark, right? That happily.
Yeah.
That is not what this is about, right? For Trump, this is on his angle, right? There's two factors. One is European weakness. The Trump administration hates the European elite. They hate him. They actively campaigned against him in multiple elections so far. He doesn't forget that. He doesn't pretend that. He does not, in political terms, right? He hates their values. He hates their repression of the populist right in countries in Europe, in Romania, and going after Orban in Hungary, in Germany, and in France, going after the AfD and the National Rally Party and so forth. He hates the European political elite. They hate him, right? Whatever is pretended with smiles and jokes, there's no secret about that. But that is one factor. He sees them as weak, and he can take what he wants. The other factor, I believe, what's really driving Trump is not so much the geostrategic value of Greenland, because the U.S. could have all of that anyway. They literally have the rights for most of it. It's about glory, legacy, and ego. Trump wants to have brought the largest chunk of territory. He wants to increase the size of the U.S. He wants the Star-Spangled Banner. How many maps has he posted online, including Greenland and now Venezuela and Canada as part of the U.S., or the Trumpian empire, whatever you want to call it. Yeah. That's what has been driving him, I believe. Now, he can always turn on a dime, because Trump can do that, because his base has the political principles and convictions of a flip-flop, right? I mean, he could back down from that and accept something less, but the Europeans haven't signaled. In fact, they've rolled over. Mark Rutte could not expose his belly any more to Trump than he already has. It's a real... And be frank, as a previous American, as a Russian now, I when I was young, I used to look up to Europe and think that they were the cultured, intelligent ones. And on many levels, politically and culturally and otherwise, I'm embarrassed for Europe now. They have no civilizational or political dignity or sovereignty left. It's really embarrassing. It's one thing for Russia to be defeating them. It's another thing for their hegemonic master, Trump, to, I don't know, play S&M games with them. It's really embarrassing, I think, for Europe, considering the civilizational history that has led up to this point of sycophancy. So I think that's Trump's real aim here. It's not so much for Russia. It's like it doesn't change that much, because the U.S. already has all the military rights to do whatever they want in Greenland. So if Trump takes Greenland, I mean, it's still in NATO's hands. It doesn't far them. Is this going to rupture NATO? No, I do not believe it is. Trump is a blip. Trump is gone in 3 years, right? And chances are, right, that someone else other than J.D. Vance will follow him, whether it's Marco Rubio on the Republican side, or a Biden-Harris clone, right? The hegemonic master is odds, are pretty good, is going to return to his normal form in just 3 years. They can wait Trump out. And I think there is going to be a long-term trend where the U.S. is going to retrench in the Western Hemisphere and push its proxies forward to the front in Europe, in the Middle East, and in Asia, right? In Europe, the Europeans, obviously, right? In the Middle East, Israel, and now Al-Qaeda. A intelligence sharing agreement was just struck between Israel, the U.S., and Al-Qaeda in Syria a couple of weeks ago, by the way. And in the Pacific, we're talking the Philippines, Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea, right? Everything is this burden sharing, division of labor. I think that part will survive Trump, right? Because there is a recognition that in relative terms, the U.S. does not have the same level of resources it did in the 90s and the 2000s, early 2000s, the height of the unipolar moment. And there's a belief that the cost of hegemony is too high, not to give up hegemony, but to make the proxies, the vassals. I know the Europeans have always imagined themselves as partners. I think they see clearly now that they are not. Yeah. But to put them forward, and there has to be more division, a better division of labor, better burden sharing. That much will survive, but NATO will survive. Now, is NATO suffering damage? Yes. Right, there is a damage in the unity of NATO. Is there a damage? If you want to speak about the transatlantic relationship and even the geopolitical ideology of Atlanticism, yeah, it's suffered, but I believe it will survive because the Europeans will just roll over for Trump as they have. That's their strategy for dealing with Trump 2.0. Right? They don't argue with him. They just roll over for the most part. Poor Prime Minister Carney in Canada has actually shown some spine and some sovereignty and independence, and he's probably going to pay for it because none of the Europeans are going to stand up like he has attempted to do apparently in the last couple of weeks. And Trump has made it clear that he's going to pay for that. I think NATO will survive. Do I believe that if there was a direct NATO-Russia conflict that broke out, right, that saw fighting in the Baltics or in Poland or something, yes, I believe that the U.S. would then be forced to come to the frame. Whether Trump wanted to or not doesn't even matter because he doesn't have the power to say no. A lot of people have fantasies about how much power Trump has. Trump is allowed a lot of leeway, right? And he has a certain amount to move the Titanic a bit, but not to avoid the iceberg, right? Ultimately, it is the aforementioned blob, right? The deep state, the permanent bureaucracy, the intelligence, the State Department, the Pentagon, the military-industrial complex. There's just too much impetus there. And he would be politically forced, whether he wanted or not to come to the rescue of the European political elite, who he despises, but to the rescue of European states, right? They would, right? I believe they believe that that's not going to happen, that they can keep just below that level. Right, that they can wage their shadow war with the CIA against Russia, that the Europeans, can keep fighting within Ukraine for years. They believe they can drag it out, raising the costs for Russia. I believe they want to make Russia choke They want to make Russia, they want to force Russia to take all of Ukraine and choke on it. I believe that's actually at least a plan B or a plan C within the framework here. But in just geopolitical terms, yes, I believe that the U.S. would come if it came down to a shooting war between Russia and NATO. And Trump's personal feelings about that relationship with the Europeans don't really factor into it. And in the length of time, Trump is a blip. And now certain things he's instituted will change, but those are things that should, from any realist perspective, have happened anyway. But the U.S. is not going to give up on the pursuit and maintenance of hegemony and primacy. They're just changing their methodology. And certainly Trump is talking about it rhetorically in a completely different way. But as far as the outside countries, Russia, China, right, others taking a look, that's just noise. You have to look at what the U.S. is actually doing, right? Yeah. When they're talking spheres of influence, right? The Western Hemisphere is ours, right? Spheres of influence. But does that mean the Pacific is China's and China can, bring Taiwan back into the fold? No, of course not. Does that mean that Russia can reabsorb Ukraine, without a major conflict? No, it doesn't, right? It doesn't work that way, right? Because the U.S. is not giving up on hegemony. It's retrenching in the Western Hemisphere, but that doesn't mean it's surrendering global sphere of influence to any, potential other great powers. It's just making the proxies shoulder more of the burden if they can. And the Europeans are the proxies in Europe, obviously.
And so here, the U.S. has to keep the European countries alive, let's say in a way of manner with energy, let's say with commodities and so forth, because without, let's say, commodities and energy, you can't wage, let's say, a war, and you can't pay interest to the U.S. So I see it. I don't know. Yeah. What do you think? Because many people here in Germany think, oh, okay, we will lose the gas, we will lose whatever, and the world breaks down. I don't think it will come this way. I hope.
Yeah. Obviously Europe, particularly Germany, right, and where Germany goes, the rest, has done themselves incredible economic and social harm with cutting off Russian gas, right? That by their own choice and their complicity with the U.S. blowing up Nord Stream, right? That is their choice. They're deindustrializing just type deindustrializing in Germany will pop up on Google, right? Yeah. That is something they've done themselves. But the U.S. is very, very happy that the Europe is now energy dependent, and particularly Germany, on the U.S., on U.S. LNG. Does it make up completely for Russian gas? No, it doesn't. It's far more expensive, and there's less of it available. But it will keep them alive, and that's happy. The U.S. is happy with that. As far as the current administration thinking is concerned, they have a resentment. First of all, they don't politically agree with the European welfare states, such as they are. The social benefits, free or reduced cost education, healthcare, and everything. As far as the Americans are concerned, they're like, why have the Europeans enjoyed this during the Cold War, while Americans have never needed that, and Americans, would be even shocked at the idea, at least a lot of them would, right? So they think it's perfectly fine for Europe to be forced to give up all of their social benefits to militarize against Russia, right? They think that is fair They think it's the way it should have been. And that, I mean, I'm not sure that will necessarily carry over into a Democratic president as a priority, but it is actually a priority for the current administration. And it's not going to factor much in. So that Trump, in his national security strategy, also very specifically talked about political regime change of Europe. He made that perfectly clear, that he wants to support populist right forces in Europe the way, well, quite fairly, that Europeans supported his political opponents, the Democrats in the United States. So he sees that as fair. And that reorientation of, from, Mertz has said it, pretty much outright, shifting from welfare to warfare.
Yeah.
Right. The Europeans are going to be expected to have meaner, littler living standards, and social benefits. And why shouldn't they? Because Americans they have never enjoyed them. I can attest to that. So that is going to be the cost of the Europeans. They will survive. NATO will still survive and function to a degree, right? But is ultimately the European citizens, the taxpayers, who are going to be forced to accept this new burden sharing, this new division of labor to maintain U.S.-led Western hegemony, with NATO as still the most important institutional structure of that.
So what do you think? Or one question I have left. You think will Vladimir Putin stay another 6 years or 5 years in the next term, or will he, let's say, step back and give, let's say, the place to Medvedev, or I don't know exactly who could follow him from the Security Council in Russia?
Yeah. So a lot of that depends on how events are going. I believe that Putin has repeatedly intended to transfer power to someone else within, his administration, right? There have been multiple people. Shoigu could have been at one point, Medvedev at one point. There are other people now, governors of various regions of Russia that are close to Putin that I think he could look to. But a lot of it depends on what is happening in Ukraine and what the geopolitical situation is with the U.S. and Europe, right? And the collective West at that point. And I believe that he probably imagined after his last election that yes, he would be able to step down. And once again, he's looking at the clock and looking at the war in Ukraine, probably saying, I'm probably going to have to do another 6 years. I don't believe that Putin wants to do that. I really don't. I believe he would if he feels that the Russian state would survive and doesn't need his hand at the helm. But it's often said you don't switch horses in midstream. Yes. And I believe that is the same. It's just there's too much at stake, right? Not just for Putin, not just for the Russian regime, right? The political regime, if you will, but for Russia as a civilization. And although that's not the priority in the way they look at the world ideologically, but really, there is too much at stake for a multipolar world future at this point, right? We're at too much of a crux point. If that hurdle can be passed, then maybe. But quite honestly, it's going to be pressing the clock. The Europeans believe they can drag this out for another 5 years in Ukraine. I don't think so, and I don't think it's so much even what is happening on the contact line, right? So much as there's an even greater chance of political and economic collapse as a result of the financial situation of supporting the Kiev regime, of these effects of these electrical infrastructure attacks, those sorts of things have a greater chance of achieving that collapse more than, shall we say, the crumbling along the contact line is achieving. But of course, at a certain level, it all factors together, right? I mean, everything has a compound effect on everything else. So to try to isolate one factor of it separate from the others maybe is a bit of a fool's game. But I believe the conflict will go on probably for another year or more, but I don't think that they can drag it out for 5 years. I think that's going, unless NATO really did directly intervene, right? The French or the British, and then dragging everyone else in or something like that. Of course, they couldn't stand against Russia on their own. That's almost a joke. They can't. They send a couple dozen troops to Greenland. Come on, they can't maintain an expeditionary force in Ukraine, even of 7,500. They're talking together. They can't do that. Yeah. It's a joke. Russia has a force within the special military operation of some 700 to 800,000 right now. Come on, the European military isn't even a paper tiger, because even on paper, their own assessment, their own talk of their own, military unstate of readiness is evident, right? The politicians don't talk about it, but the internal assessments are reported on the media. They're there for everyone to see. You know very well, right? Germans practicing with broomsticks and the 10-20% of military vehicles actually being operable. Various. That's across the, shall we say, the military powers of Europe, the UK, France, Germany, and so on. Actually, the Poles probably have their shit militarily together more than any of the others at this point, and they're actually gaining some strength as far as I can see.
They try hard to push it up, but the money also in Germany, we have always some writings and some comments that many of the 100 billion of euros, which were to the so-called Sondervermögen, which is special, I don't know where they are and where they're going. I don't see them on the ground. They produce now many modern things, yes, but not in the quantity like Russia does. No. And I can't imagine that we will have any chance to match up with the modern Russian, for example, drone war capacities. We don't have this. They try to...
The new Helsing drones. The new Helsing drones that Germany just provided to Ukraine. Ukraine sent them back because they said they don't work. They can't even launch them. The launchers don't work. The AI algorithms don't work. Everything they were supposed to do, they're a complete failure. And this is why the Russians look at Europe and do not see a military threat. They regard the Americans as a military threat, right? And there's always the threat of the Americans being dragged in, but they don't see the Europeans as a military threat. There's reasons for that. And to be frank, as a former U.S. military person, until Europe has a unified military-industrial complex, they will never achieve the great power results that Russia and China and the U.S. have. They can't. They won't. And you have, a dozen different military-industrial complexes, boutique capabilities spread among countries with all the pork and the bureaucracy and everything else. You just have no idea how inhibiting that is in creating a really real military capability. And to be perfectly honest, from everything I've seen, the Europeans do not have the will to power. They don't have the fighting spirit to exert themselves on the world stage as a great power. Separately or in any unified, certainly not in any unified fashion. And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we should be past that. We aren't, right? That's the real world we live in. I have I separate my own desires for humanity from my realist, cynical political analysis, right? And what I want for humanity doesn't matter, right? What I wish, what I hope, so forth. But the reality is we do live in a world of great powers. We have always done, right? Simply we lived so far under a unipolar moment led by the United States that we've forgotten, and that has been ameliorated, shall we say, for the last few decades. But due to relative shifts of economics and military power, that temporary historical moment is now gone, for good and for ill, right? Because there are both good and bad consequences, and a lot of that simply determines of where you're sitting on the globe. So
better sitting in Moscow than in Europe in the next years, I think so. Okay, Mark, I thank you very much for your time, for the many things you explained to us, and I hope to see you next time. And for everybody, please subscribe to Boosty, the Real Politic with Mark Sleboda. I hope you will find many informations like I always do for my shows on his channel. So thank you very much. Have a good day, and we see next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for the shameless shilling, and I will look forward with pleasure to our next conversation. And do svidaniya to all my German friends out there.
Bye-bye, Mark. Have a good time. Thank you.